right. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for attending. I'm really excited to speak to you today. I kind of, when I do these art talks in the last year or two, I kind of thought maybe I need to talk about, everybody asks about my process or what I'm thinking. And, I'm a landscape painter and I'm a realistic painter. And, a lot of times I kind of think, well, I don't really have anything that deep to say. But, some people have these great themes and ideas. And for me, I just like painting the West. And I like painting the mountains that we're surrounded by. I mean, I grew up on Wasatch Drive just over here. I've spent my life looking at Mount Olympus. I feel like I could paint Mount Olympus every day, and it's a different mountain. But I look at shows and I look at things, the artists that I really admire, and it seems like it's the same people that always get in the shows, that get the awards, and I look at their artwork and I'm like, what makes their artwork so exciting? Why do these just few people always seem to stand out? And then I was thinking about my own work. Where do I have the most fun doing paintings, and what makes what I feel like my artwork is success? How can it be the most successful that it can be? And I remember thinking that, and this even goes back to when I was in high school. I painted a painting of the Grand Canyon, and I love the Grand Canyon because there's just so much depth, and I love painting shadows in the depth. And I was thinking, well, for me, paintings that are interesting will have a lot of depth. And then, as my training was mentioned, I'm a graphic designer, and so I started looking at, when I got out of my University of Utah with my graphic design degree and with my BFA, there was an artist named Maynard Dixon that had never come up in my entire time at the University of Utah. And I'm like, who is this Maynard Dixon? He's just so cool. I've discovered this great artist. And as I dug deeper, I realized how famous he really was. But, if you look at his paintings, they are just so well designed. And as a graphic designer, that design really appealed to me. So I was like, okay, for a painting, the most important thing is the design, and then depth, whenever you find depth in a painting. And then as a realist, I'm always about detail. And so then I was doing it, there was an article that was going to be written about me in Western Art Collector, and I was trying to think of something profound to say, and I thought, well, I'll just talk about the 3Ds. And I thought, well, that's easy to remember. So I'm hoping that tonight, I want to be just really, straightforward and easy with about, my artwork, and just the idea that you just have to think about 3Ds when you're planning some artwork. So the first thing, and I was thinking about this really is probably in level of importance. So for me, the most important thing for the painting is the design. So the first painting up here is, of course, very realistic, but I spent a long time thinking about the design. Now, I don't know if you have seen this movie, the Steven Spielberg movie recently called The Fabelmans, but there's a scene in there where you had David Lynch playing the director John Ford. And John Ford was a very famous movie maker, from the 30s and 40s. And, he brings this young filmmaker in who's really based on Steven Spielberg. And he was like, how do you want to make film? Why do you want to make films? And he started stuttering. He's like, what do you know about art? He had all these great Western paintings in the background. And he said, what's going on in the painting? And the guy starts stuttering about cowboys, and this John Ford guy is going, no, where's the horizon line? So if you look at this painting, the horizon line is up high. And then he said, where's this other painting? So the horizon line is down low. And so then he goes, well, if the horizon line is in the middle, it's boring as heck. So he used another word, but, and so to me, that's like, okay, first thing I do with a painting, when I'm planning out the painting, is where's the horizon line? And if it's a high horizon line, or if the horizon line is up high, it's usually going to be, a lot about, the mountains, the shapes of the shadows, all of that. If it's low, it's going to be about clouds. And sometimes you'll end up with something in the middle, but I know what that director is talking about. You want to have, some some kind of contrast. And I think about ratios. Now, I'm not really a math person, but I'm kind of thinking about like this first painting. Maybe the top is maybe if that's even an 8, like 1/8 sky, and then the rest of it is. You want to find a good ratio between sky, mountain, foreground, and usually, the rule of thumb is kind of third, 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 but that can be kind of boring. So how can you mix that up? And to me, that's the fun of landscape painting, when you're trying to find something different, a different combination. So then the next thing, which I mentioned, is depth. And this goes back to when I was in high school and painting the Grand Canyon, and I just love the shadows. And so and growing up here in Salt Lake, and I grew up on the east side, and I'm always looking at the mountains to the west. So in the evening, they're always a lot grayer, they're a lot lighter. Whenever I can get that feeling of distance with color and intensity. So the closer the colors are to you, the more intense, the more dark they are, the more contrast there is between light and shade. The further back, all of that kind of grays out, and there's not as much contrast. And so I'm trying to use those colors to create depth. And I've been doing this for over 30 years, and I still find myself, I'm always lightening shadows in my paintings. And that's, I think, the key with atmospheric perspective, is making sure your shadows are not too dark, not too intense. Especially in clouds. I think sometimes, and sometimes artists can get it to work, but for me, if the shadows in the clouds are too dark, then it makes everything too dark. So I'm always trying to find that perfect balance of, how do you get that depth just using color. And here's another one. And as you notice further back, the mountains in the back are very blue. The shadows up front are really quite dark. It actually is it's nice now with digital cameras. The information in shadows comes through so much easier. And I probably mentioned, I do a lot of this preparatory work on the computer. Because as my job as a graphic designer, I'm on Photoshop, the computer, all the time. Yes?
What's your medium?
Well, these are all oil. But I've got a few digital paintings that I'll show too. But so I'm planning these out on the screen before I even start the painting. But sometimes if the shadow is too dark, you can lighten, you can pull a lever in Photoshop. You can see the information of what's happening in the shadow. Because the other thing I want to avoid too is I don't want the shadows to feel like they're holes. I want it to feel like there's something in there. And then detail. And this is a sticky thing because now almost all my career, all my life, the art teachers always say, "Oh, you're putting in too much detail. You got to take detail." And that's a good thing. You don't want to, but there's something about the way I like to paint. I like having some interest in there. So I use the term detail though, meaning interest. So, and I'm trying to imply detail as much as I can. And I'm not trying to render the entire scene. I'm selective about what I have detail, but I still want it to feel, fairly realistic. Now there's some artists that, there's an artist named Ed Mell who, he just passed away recently, but he's perfect with these really flat shapes, and I love them. But when I'm painting, I can't do that myself. I gotta have some of the texture, like you can kind of see here. Anytime with rock, with trees, with the landscape, I love the texture that you can get, and that's kind of, I think, my thing is having that detail. So, and I think what I want you to hopefully come away with is if you like doing something, even if other people say, "Oh, you shouldn't be doing that," if you feel like that's you, keep doing it. And then going back to the Grand Canyon, it's I love shadow and the different textures that you get from evening light, and to me that's the detail. So I'm trying to get look for the patterns, but I also want the rock to feel like it's rock. I don't want it to just necessarily be a flat shape. Okay. That was mentioned, I don't know if I work for the University of Utah. I've been an art director. I'm currently art director for the Marketing and Communications Office, but I've worked there full-time for 33 years. And so I have a lot of commercial experience, and I always, for me, commercial art and fine art kind of go hand in hand. They are different businesses with commercial illustration. You have a client kind of telling you what to do. You don't have the freedom of fine art. But all of the fine artists that I tend to like, people like Maynard Dixon, Edward Hopper, they all seem to kind of come out of commercial art. And so I love commercial art. As a kid, I loved illustrated book covers and that kind of stuff. So I love being a commercial artist, and I think there's a lot of crossover. So I do stuff like this for the university. This is a campus painting I did in 2014. The campus keeps changing. The buildings are getting to be kind of different. This is something I did 2 years ago. And you can see that, just because it's the same kind of scene, you can have a different, different shape of canvas, different time of day, different kind of time of season. Don't be afraid to keep going back to the same subject over and over again if it's something that's compelling to you. This was an interesting project that happened about, I think, 10 years ago, where UHealth came to me and they said, well, we want something of the hospital. And when you go up there, it's just kind of like this big mass of buildings, and there's nothing that's like really iconic about the place. But as an artist, I think it helped that I've kind of grown up in that area. I love that area, and to me, it's like, it's like the hills above and looking, down at the lake and at the city, and it becomes less about the buildings and it becomes about the environment and the place. And so, fortunately, they kind of gave me carte blanche to do what I wanted, and I had a lot of fun doing this painting, which I think normally, what you want to avoid as an artist, where it's like you're doing somebody else's vision and it's just no fun to do. You want to do what is exciting to you, which for me is, these landscapes, this depth, these colors that you get with evening light, all that kind of stuff. This was a painting that I did about 6 months ago. They're working on a project where they've got an old restored truck that Swoop is going to have at events and things. We were out at the Great Salt Lake, and so, but as I was putting this together, I was thinking, this is an example though of, look at where the horizon line is. It's right in the middle, and every so often when I'm looking through these photos for other things, there is one where we took the truck, and it was at a really low angle, and it was a better angle of the truck, and I probably should have used that, but there was part of me that I really wanted to have the mountains so you could see more, and so, but that's the thing as an artist, you're always at these trade-offs. So sometimes I do break these rules, and sometimes, like with this one, I don't think it was as exciting as probably it could be, but that's how it goes. And then this is an example of, they came to us with, they had an AI concept, but of course AI couldn't do the clouds, the city, and then the people I ended up using as reference. But if you were really, I think, gonna do something real, we needed to have real students, because whenever I look at this, it still feels a little kind of AI, but they needed it in 2 or 3 days, and we just didn't have time. I'm sure you hear a lot about AI coming up in art and that, but it's like, to me, I don't feel that threatened, because it's like, as artists, we still just know how to make stuff. Like, you don't really need AI to generate images. We can go out and get our own images, and we can make our own artwork. And so it can help with ideas and things like this, but see, I had my own clouds, I had my own shot of the city, and we were able to take something that was generated and make something, I think, a lot better than what AI did. But then this was from a commercial that we shot. This is at my front porch, and we just had a great photo to use for reference. This is something I'm working on right now. I just finished actually today. And then this was for a project we were doing a couple years ago, where the football team was playing in uniforms to celebrate the USS Salt Lake City. They actually had hand-painted helmets, and then everybody thought that I actually did the helmets, that hand-painted them, but there were 150 helmets, and I'm glad I didn't have to paint them, because that was like way too many. But we had a website that was telling the story of the USS Salt Lake City, and it was one of those things where it was like nice to be involved as an artist, because an artist and an illustrator can tell these stories so much better than even, I mean, old photos are great, but an old photo isn't going to necessarily tell you, you know, the battles and things that were fought. And so I was able to do about 6 or 7 paintings for this series, and then we used the paintings in the video that we played at halftime and really told the story of why this ship was important to the city, and the team was honoring that. Now this next series of images that I'm showing you, this is my digital style, and as somebody who like paints really realistically, it's really nice to have like an alternative way of working, and this is using Adobe Illustrator to create flat shapes. So I'm still using the same idea with the depth and design, but I'm limited in where I can't like paint like all of the detail. I have to have like a light side and a shadow side. But as you can tell though, I still have a fair amount of shapes and stuff going on. So the park building one I probably did about 20 years ago, and then this one I actually just did last year. Yeah, was there a question?
Yeah, well, I was going to make a comment. Clear back when I attended Utah State, we worked with silk screen, and there was a limit in terms of what you could do with silk screen, and oftentimes we do a split screen where you put one color at top and another one at the bottom, and ultimately bleed them together. And you could do 3 or 4 different screens, and it's amazing the variation that you could come up with.
Yeah.
And so Photoshop affords us, that kind of opportunity to come back in and simplify.
Well, my professor at the U was Meikle, who was a very famous silk screen artist. Well, he would come up with this design. He had a silk screener who did it. And there is a difference. I mean, those silk screens, I mean, because it's real ink, and I've talked to Rob about this, there really is no bleeding silk screen. It's just so cool. These are useful in my work, because sometimes the deadlines are so quick, and sometimes you have to make changes. So they work, but they also, I can do nice prints, but they do lack, I think, sometimes that handmade feel that you can get from like a real silk screen. But I do draw each individual shape. I draw them digitally in Illustrator. I'm putting, the points down. I'm creating the vector shapes myself. So I'm not just taking a photo and posterizing it. I'm thinking in terms of, okay, light side, shadow side, and creating the exact shape I want. And in some ways, these take much longer than paintings. And then I do a series of illustrations. I've been doing them for quite a while for the U, where they go on trips to different places. And so I do these, I call it my travel style. But like I say, they start out kind of the same way with light and shadow, but I am I'm forced to make sure the shapes and the designs are all really kind of simplified, and it's a lot of fun and I feel like it influences my paintings too, because I do think more of like, how can I simplify my composition, how can I make the composition more dynamic, and all of that. And so I've done 60 of these over my time at the U. And then like this one in Columbia, I keep thinking how much, and you can see I'm a detail person, because even though you are limited with shapes and stuff, I still end up doing some of these very complicated scenes, and I do have to figure out how these structures all work, because the computer's not going to solve it for me, and even though I have a really good reference photo, I still have to figure out the perspective and how the light's hitting the building and all of that. So it's a lot of fun. This was something that I did for there's a Ken Garf area in the Garf Executive Administration Building up at the U. They wanted to show their old dealership, what it looked like in the 50s, and they gave me an old photograph. And of the building, and the photograph was cool and the sign was cool, but I was just like, what am I gonna do with this, building? How do I make it interesting? And then it kind of dawned on me, because I love mechanical things. I love cars and stuff, and I thought, well, let's just do like a car that they would have sold in the 50s. And so it then became about the car and the sign, and then it was a lot of, but that's what, as an illustrator, you have to do. You have to think of how can you do what is interesting to you for this problem. I think sometimes you're just used to people coming in and saying, I want this, this, and this, and you go, okay, how can I do that? But you have to think, how can I bring myself into the project? Yeah.
So ultimately, they gave you the scrap, or you got it.
They gave me the building.
Yeah, but my question is, how difficult was it to sell them on including the car in the solution? Not at all?
Not really, yeah. I just, I think I sent them the concept, and they liked it, and I went ahead. We did a large giclée print. It's like 36 by 48 up there. So the prints are cool, but like I say, they're not as cool as a real silk screen print. But yeah. I don't know how I would do this with silk screen, because in some ways these are very complex. Right. I'm dealing with blends and things, but yeah, in some ways this style works really well for this kind of work.
Yeah.
So.
Do you guys have a printing shop at the U that's doing this, or are you?
I send this out to a place called Atelier that they do large giclée prints. And the U has a print and copy service, which is really, they have a nice digital press, but we are doing these really, really large. And this is the building I went to school in. The art building's on the other side, but you can see how, for architecture, this style is a lot of fun to do. And the nice thing is you can really get the perspective. And then the Salt Lake City came to me. This is before they had built the new airport, and they wanted to do an advertisement to show what the building was going to look like before it was even done. And so they showed me the renderings of the building, but I kind of, I wanted to show the city. And then of course, I'm going to talk about the mountains and clouds. So again, it becomes, not as much about the building, which is the main thing they came to me for, but it's about, the place, the mountains, the clouds. And then of course, with airplanes, I have fun putting them in, but really, if you look at where it's placed in the design, Mount Olympus is front and center there. And so it's funny is they still use this artwork. If you go through the signage and stuff at the airport, you'll see this in the background behind a lot of things. And sometimes when I'm leaving, I put my credit card in to pay for the parking, and then my picture comes up, and it's like, well, I'm paying money, but I get to look at my artwork. I didn't get paid for the job. And they came back a couple years later. They were doing a book about the history of the airport, and they liked that other illustration enough, but they wanted a version that showed what the airport looked like in the 50s. So, I found some scrap of the old airplane. I think I might have gotten the Salt Lake City color wrong, but it was again, it was just a lot of fun to do. Now, as was mentioned, this was for the director Wes Anderson. He's a very well-known director. He does, a lot of probably, maybe say indie films. I mean, they're not like blockbusters, but he has sort of a cult following. If you like his movies, people have either really heard of him and they love him, or they've never heard of him at all. But he's very quirky, but very visual. And he had seen some of my paintings in an ad for probably like Western Art Collector. And so I'm in this gallery I'm in down in Tucson. Every so often they'll do ads and stuff. And so he started looking at my work, and this project came along. And so I was actually working on a really large mural project at the time, and I get this email from a movie producer, and he's like, well, this director really likes your work, and he wants to talk to you about this project, but you need to sign an NDA. And I was sort of like, well, I'm too busy with this mural. I was already really behind on the mural, and I thought, well, it's probably just some local production. They need a painting for the wall, but I need to talk to him, and so I signed the NDA, and then the producer said, well, the director is Wes Anderson. I was like, whoa, that's crazy, because he's like you know, he works with Tom Hanks, Scarlett Johansson. You know, he can get any A-list actor in his movies, and you know, why is he coming to Salt Lake City, Utah for, you know, artwork? But he, you know, they sent the script, and you know, you know, he needed artwork for this billboard, and I think it helped that I had done the Welcome to Utah billboards, but he also liked, and getting back to the detail that, you know, my art teachers had always told me to get away from. That was when I asked the producer later why they picked me, because that was the thing I kept thinking is, I mean, there are literally thousands of Western artists, you know, that do really nice work. Why did he come to me? What you know? And he said, well, it's your detail, you know, putting the detail in. So that's why I say when you get feedback that, you know, I mean, it's good to take feedback, but don't, if you feel like it's important to what you're doing, you know, ignore it, because it might be the very thing that makes your work different and unique. So here's how it was used in the movie. You know, we sent a digital file, they printed it in Spain on the set, because they created this town that was set in Nevada and Arizona, but it was really filmed in Spain. And then they needed some other artwork that was for these, they ended up just being black and white, but that's Edward Norton there, and they, again, created this really, you know, amazing looking composition for the scene, but he needed, you know, he wanted some cool artwork for the movie. Now, it ended up first being one billboard, then I did 2 additional paintings, and then a year later they came back and they needed like these 4 ones that I did, and then a little while later they were like, well, we need something for the poster, and so I ended up doing the teaser poster, and he really liked, and I've got the slide later on, but I had done a painting of my billboard, my Welcome to Utah billboard, in a landscape, and I'd sent that to Wes Anderson, and he loved that idea, and he wanted to use that actually in the teaser poster. So somebody sent me this picture. This was at a movie theater, and there's the painting right there. So then they used this for, like, you know, different things.
Oh, wow.
That's Wes Anderson. And the thing about this project was, I was working with Wes Anderson directly by email. Like, he wanted to give me the notes directly. I wasn't working through his production designer or the set designer, art director. He was so hands-on with his movie. He was telling me what to do.
Can I ask, I'm curious, so a lot of your stuff has lettering, and my sister writes books, and so she
Yeah.
said it's very different, like, artwork to do. Are they making you aware we need to put Asteroid City on this, and you're kind of working through that?
Well, what's interesting is he wanted, so when I did this, he wanted the Asteroid City painted. And so I did it by hand, and I don't know if you've ever tried painting lettering.
So
I mean,
hard.
that's very difficult, but I think he likes things that are handmade, but I wouldn't have done it like that. But then when the final thing came out, I could tell they had photoshopped out what I had done, and they'd used, like, you know, Adobe Illustrator vector file lettering. So, you know, so they ended up not using what I had painted, because I think there was just too much, you know, it just wasn't precise enough.
Yeah, right.
So you had that,
It's
before you
good.
did the painting though, you knew you had to fit that in
Yeah,
there.
yeah. But then they even, the disappointing thing though was, they gave me the exact size, but, and I can tell they had to Photoshop out because they needed to get a little more room, but, you know, they had approved the composition and they'd done it exactly how they wanted, but then, you know, they had such a big cast, they had to make the poster bigger. But, you know, I look at those clouds and it's like, I would have done some different shapes a little bit higher up, you know, but that's the designer part of me where it's like, you know, I would have.
So did someone else do the clouds?
Yeah, so their artists had to, like, go in and Photoshop and, you know, redo it. So, but it was fun. I have a brother-in-law and his son lives in New York, so they were sending me photos of, they did a campaign in New York, so on a New York taxi, artwork and going into the subway. But now, I just wanted to show you some of this is my gallery work, and so this is the work I do without having like a client, somebody telling me what to do, and this is really my favorite part of being an artist. I mean, even though I have a commercial background, like I love just doing what I like. I like, you know, painting the landscapes and things that are interesting to me, not having somebody saying, oh, can you do this, you know, or I think it's living up to somebody else's expectation is always kind of hard. And this is the painting that was mentioned that I won a Best of Show award at the Springville Salon this year. This is still up in the Springville Art Museum right now. If you go down, it'll be up until the 3rd of July. But the thing about this is, this kind of goes back to the philosophy I was mentioning, the 3Ds. I didn't have a lot of time for this painting. I had a show at Dave Erickson's in March, and this 3rd week of March, that's when Gallery Stroll is. I had the show, and it takes a while to get ready for a show. It takes several months for me to do enough work to fill out the show. And so I knew the salon was coming up, but I was like, oh, am I gonna have time? But I thought, no, I had a big, nice frame. I had a 60-inch by 40, I think it was 36 by 60-inch frame that I'd gotten from somewhere. And I thought, I've got a week before it's due. So the day after the show, I got up, I planned out this scene a couple of days before, after I finished the work for the show. I did this all, using thinking, okay, how can I make this composition dynamic, what's interesting, and I just knocked this out in a week, and I was able to, yeah.
So I'd be interested in hearing, in particular on this painting, what were your reference photos? Did you, from the reference photo, did you change your light directions and make up your own light? And what were your references for the clouds, and how much of them are from your head, and how much of them?
Okay, that's a really great question. Okay, because I cannot make stuff up, and whenever I make things up, it always looks fake. And so I love using my own reference. And so I was down in Torrey. This is looking west, and I was able to get this. I was out shooting some mesas. The other, I turned around, and this scene was just, it was just perfect for me. So I shot a bunch of stuff, but there wasn't any clouds in the sky. But I was on a different trip, a few weeks later down in St. George, looking the same direction, and there were these really gorgeous clouds that were, just lit up. Now, it was like all these houses and things in front, but that's the nice thing about having an iPhone camera is, and it used to be, I would be like, when I'd shoot my reference with 35mm, I'd always see like cool clouds and stuff, and it's like, I don't have my camera with me, but who wants to carry a camera around with them everywhere? And now, like, you can just pull out your phone, and if there's a great set of clouds, you can take a picture of that, and so I have a file of clouds that I like, and I've got a file of scenes that I think are really beautiful. And sometimes the mountains are cool, but the foreground is, it's a parking lot or something. But I can, take pictures of, like some sagebrush or some fields, or, I'm crafting these scenes, but I'm not making stuff up. I can't just, if I make up a tree, it looks like I've made up a tree. I can't make it up.
Totally understand what you're saying. And so in these, you're taking it from a phone. Color is not always true. A lot of artists will go out and do color reference plein air, something like that. So how did you look at those and adjust, if you did, the colors to match the clouds with what you saw?
Well, it was about the same time of day. So like the sun had already set when I took that picture, or it was just, the foreground was in shadow, and you're just picking up the light hitting the cliffs, and it was the same thing that was happening in St. George. So really, it was just a matter of taking the clouds and putting them behind, But I want to be careful, because I've seen some artists where they'll do like clouds and they just feel so out of scale with things. And so I do try, and as a realist, I still want to make sure things feel correct, And I do try and have the idea that, you know, the cloud, you can see the clouds going back off in the distance. And so, because sometimes you'll see clouds that just, like, they just look too tall in front of mountains. And I can tell that the artist is kind of, in Photoshop, they just stuck, you know, big set behind it. You know, it looks okay, but it just doesn't, to me, I still want to feel convincing, you know. But as a designer, I'm crafting the scene. I'm not limited by, okay, this photo, I don't want to just copy what's in the photo. I'm creating the scene. Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about your process. Do you come in and do some kind of a pencil sketch on your canvas to start with? And when you start painting, do you paint the background first and then move forward? Or do you paint on the whole thing all at once, all over the place? Tell us a little bit about what you're doing.
Well, what I do, and see, this I think comes from my commercial background, where it's like I don't want to spend a lot of time guessing what I'm doing, so I try and get everything like planned out before I start. And I know that there's probably some artists that they like the spontaneity of things and that's great, but for me it's like I want to know how the painting's gonna work out. And so what I do, and I've learned this over time, is and especially with now with Photoshop, I know that I take the size of the canvas and I'll create the size in Photoshop to match the shape of the canvas exactly, and then I'll take my photo and I'll put it in, and then I'll crop, I'm cropping in Photoshop, but it's
Sure.
matched to the exact shape that I'm dealing with on the canvas. And then if I'm adding, different things, and what I try and do is I make sure that, like, if the foreground, I'm trying to make sure the foreground, usually the light is coming from the exact same direction, and that it's convincing. I usually, and I found it's hard if I try and do just one half of one side and stick it in, sometimes it doesn't feel natural. But if you kind of layer, if you have a set of mountains, then you put like a foreground, and then clouds behind, it will work out. So I'll get a reference that's exactly how I want it, and then I do a very simple grid. I do half and half, and then I draw the same on my canvas. I used to put the drawing on a projector, but to me it's like sometimes it just took too long to set up the projector, and to me it was like, if you just do a really simple grid, I know grids can be like, you can do moldable squares, but if you just do a simple half and half, you just put in the quadrant that you're doing, sometimes that's all you need to get the drawing to be accurate. And so then I draw it out, and then I put a wash on, an acrylic wash, because I don't want to wait for the oil to dry. Kind of lock in the drawing, and then I block it in, usually as fast as I can, get the color, so like a big painting like this, it still might take 3 or 4 hours, but I'll use like quite a large brush, and I'm just trying to get the colors. I'm not worried about detail at this point, but I'm just trying to get the colors and the atmosphere and the feeling, and then I get that done, and then usually when it's dry, then I come back, and then I'm really kind of fine-tuning the values, and I think in this photo the clouds tend to look a little bit darker than it really was, but I spent a lot of time lightening the clouds, because I think sometimes your shadows do tend to get darker, especially in clouds, than you even realize. And so I'm always like lightening the background and the shadows. And I just tighten it up.
So then you pretty much worked on the entire surface all at once?
Yeah, I usually try and when I first started, I used to do like one little section and get it done and move on, and now I'm like, I want the whole thing, I want the feeling to be all there, and then tighten up. Yeah.
Yeah, so then if you're trying to improve your dry time, are you using mediums?
I like liquid. It takes about 24 to 48 hours for the paint to dry.
And in terms of your colors, are you making relatively large color pools and then comparing them so that you get your distance effects in there?
I'm kind of just mixing on a palette that's like this big, and then I'll wipe it out, and then I'll start a new batch of color for different areas. And then sometimes the colors sometimes the colors dry too dark, or they're too dark, and then I go back and I lighten. Sometimes they're perfect when I first block it in, and then I try and do some adjustments, and then when I go back, it's too dark, so I have to go back a third time or a fourth time. But that's just part of the process. But I also, you know, when you start out, I like using really big brushes, but then I'll use small brushes to make sure I'm, you know, filling everything in right, but then go back to bigger brushes. And to me, it's really important to use the right size brush when you're filling in, because there's nothing worse than like trying to fill in a big area with too small of a brush. But then on the other hand, if you've got a big brush and you need to get that detail, you know, like I love the little round, you know, number 1 or whatever. I love just, so it's just, yeah, but make sure you're using the right brush. So here's a painting I did this year. This is up in Smithfield. My parents are both from Cache Valley, and the mountain behind is called Flat Top, and I've looked at that mountain my whole life, and I love it. And so again, this is how the light was, but I composed this scene from reference that I shot while we were at a family barbecue on the last 4th of July, and you know, I just shot a bunch of stuff, but I've been able to make use out of it. This is a kind of a composed scene. My daughter actually was driving away from St. George, and she took this photo. And of course, there was nothing in the sky, but I took a bunch of Joshua tree photos, and I thought, well, it'd be fun to make a Joshua tree that just kind of breaks up the shape, but then have the cliffs and the stuff in the background, you know, there. And so, again, this is, and I think this goes back to what Maynard Dixon and like Ed Mell do, is where they, you know, they're not just copying what they see in the photo, they're creating, and that's where I've been really trying to push my work is where I'm like getting an idea and then getting my reference to match my idea. And then, yeah, this is the same area in Smithfield, but this is looking west. This is a sunset scene. I was experimenting with the idea of like how much color can I get in the sunset? Can I really get the idea of the, you know, because I think we look at sunsets and we see the color, but sometimes when we look at our photos, they don't quite, this happens to me all the time. I look at my photos like, oh, what was I thinking? There was nothing there. But I found when you start like blowing it up or start redrawing it, or you draw it big on canvas, then that magic that you saw, I think sometimes comes back. This is for the gallery down in Tucson. This is North Rim of the Grand Canyon. This is Monument Valley. Again, I'm just sort of playing with shapes. You know, to be honest, the sunset is a Salt Lake sunset, but I wasn't at sundown in Monument Valley, but I wanted to capture that feeling. This is Ghost Ranch in New Mexico. This is Cerro Pendernal. George O'Keeffe painted this mountain a lot, but Madeline, who's here, she actually took the picture of the sunset that I used for this. So my kids get roped into helping out with photos. And this is a painting I just barely got back from the framer. This is going to go to Meyer Gallery in Santa Fe. This is the Taos Mountains. Again, going back to the very first thing, look at where the horizon line is really low, but also the sky is very minimal. I'm playing with, you know, very different ratios. I don't want to just do third, third, third. And I'm also looking for diagonals. Very strong diagonals, I think, help a composition. Sandia Mountains, I was at a work trip. We were staying outside of Albuquerque, and I took these photos. I had a lot of fun with that. And of course, Mount Olympus, a mountain I grew up looking at every day, and I love it. And then I love the sunsets we have here in Salt Lake. This was I was commissioned by the Garf family to create this triptych for it's in the Garf Executive Education Building on campus. And then this is a large, if you ever go up to Building 540, I did a large Bryce Canyon painting there. And here's what I was mentioning. So I did the billboards in my graphic style, but I thought it would be a fun painting to do the graphic billboard in a landscape. So my son said, oh, that's kind of meta. But but. And this is, so there's actually 7 different designs depending on which way you come into the state. We were down in Monument Valley, and so I was able to get a picture of the billboard with the kind of the famous maces behind it. That was a lot of fun to do. Dead Horse Point. And again, I love the Grand Canyon, but I love Bryce Canyon, but it's a different design-wise. It's very difficult with all of the little hoodoos and things. Like, you don't have the depth and the strong shapes that you have at the Grand Canyon, but it is kind of a fun challenge to tackle. But then my personal opinion, my favorite point of the Grand Canyon is on the North Rim, Bright Angel Canyon. This one was actually, I sent down to Medicine Man Gallery for their, I think it was their 30-year anniversary, and the owner asked me, he said, do you think you could do a 9-foot Grand Canyon for this? And I thought that sounds like a lot of fun to do. And so I think it's 9 feet by, I can't remember, 5 or 6 feet. We had to, shipping it down was kind of interesting, but he got it sold to somebody, somebody had a big house in Tucson, and a few years later I got invited to his house to see it. But I feel like this is my favorite painting of the Grand Canyon that I've done. Now I get the opportunity to work for the LDS Church. These paintings are of not necessarily the West or Utah. This was a waterfall in Africa. But again, this is like, I'll find photo reference because I'm not getting sent to Africa, but I try and find things to make the scene my own. So, the clouds, the foreground, all of that I try and change up. So here's a picture so you can get a sense of the scale of this piece. This was sent to a temple in Frankfurt, Germany. This is a seascape in Okinawa. Again, like the clouds were Oregon clouds, but so I try and find things to make it your own. And I added the birds and of course the framing, the layout. This was for a temple in Medford, Oregon. Now this was reference that I shot myself. This is Crater Lake. Although, when I travel, people always say, like, do I want to paint Europe? And it's like, well, I like painting the West more, but if there's an opportunity, I will do some of these. And that's what's fun about these projects, is I'm doing things that are different. This is Mount Fitzroy in Patagonia in Argentina. This is, the river is from a different reference, but, I'm trying to match up the light. The clouds are something that I shot here. This is a waterfall in Mexico. And then last year, this is my most recent ones. This is a place called Cuernavaca outside of Mexico City. And then cliffs of Acapulco. And then this is in the Red Hills Temple in St. George. This was actually for another project that I did, but they ended up putting it in that temple. But again, thinking about like verticals as opposed to horizontals, and Kolob Canyon is one of my favorite spots, but that's and Grand Canyon actually has a lot of opportunities for verticals. I think as landscape painters, we just think, oh, things are horizontal. You'll notice a lot of my work are squares, and I think squares are really kind of abstract, and it forces me to think a little more conceptually, but verticals can be fun too. Now, I've had an opportunity to do a couple of room-sized murals. So this is something that was in Meridian, Idaho. This is the Sawtooth Mountains. You can kind of see how the painting's designed to wrap around the room.
So are you using a grid here or a projector? Or?
This one, so I included these so you can kind of see. I had to paint this on the floor because I didn't have the ceiling space to do that. So I did grid it out. did the same way I described though. I got my reference photos and I knew exactly the shape of the wall that I was doing. I knew where the doors were gonna be, I knew where the vents were gonna be, but I had to just kind of grit it out and then paint this one on my hands and knees. And also, it was so long, it went outside, I had to paint half of it, then roll it up, and then paint the other half. And then, but this one I actually was able to put the pieces up around, so I was able to match the edges. So you can kind of see how that went. And then, so that's my studio, my garage studio. But then I did the St. George. Those were so big, I had to do each piece on the floor. There's 12 sections, and so you can see that's one section. You can kind of see how I've drawn it out. You can see the wash I put down. Now this was the linen. This is like linen that I got from a place in New York. They wanted a very heavyweight, very high quality linen, and it was an oil-based gesso. And because it's oil-based, I didn't use an acrylic wash. I used an oil wash because I didn't want to mix the. You can put oil on the acrylic, but not the other way around. But you can kind of see how I drew. I had to do the whole thing on the floor, and then when we put the sections up, that was the first time I saw the whole thing together. So I had to do a lot of matching of edges and even some colors, but that took a long time. And then here's, you gotta get a sense of scale. Again, going back to the detail, I was kind of like, oh, I was doing this field of like sagebrush, but I was trying to control, like I wasn't trying to put in every single leaf, but I still wanted to get that feeling of what does a field of sagebrush look like. And you can kind of see this is the.
How does the linen go on the walls? Is it plastered on or
Well,
carefully, I'm sure.
It's called Biva, and I can't remember the number. There's a very specific glue that you use. So it's basically like wallpaper, but you put it up, and then you really have to roll it on, and you have to make sure that it stays flat, because sometimes you'll get off-gassing from the glue, and you get these bubbles, and if you get bubbles, the light, picks up the highlight. You can tell there's a bubble there, so I'd hired a crew to install it, and then, we had a real problem with bubbles with that project, so it took a long time to get everything flat. And then, of course, I'm touching up and stuff, so. But, so, sorry, I think I've gone a little bit over time.
No.
But,
You got 20 minutes.
okay, well, I'm happy to take any questions, yeah.
I'm very much an amateur. I don't understand how you can go from a photo reference to paint, well, your first slides of Salt Lake City Valley, so incredibly accurate and detailed. How do you go from a photograph to that kind of detail and accuracy for the buildings?
Well, it's a lot of practice, but it's also, I am looking at the photo, but I'm also painting what I know too. The photo is giving me information, but I'm trying not to necessarily copy what's there. But it's nice when you can get on the screen and you can blow up the scene and you can look at it closer and you can kind of understand what's going on. So that's the advantage of digital photography when you're using that for your reference, is you can really dig in there and see what's happening.
Your work is incredibly good.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Do you ever use Procreate?
I have a little bit. I tend to just go with Adobe Illustrator for my graphic stuff, because I'm drawing these shapes. But if I'm going to do something that looks painted, I'll just go to Photoshop, or I'll just go to oil paint by hand.
Yeah.
But I've used it. I like it, but it's like if I'm gonna do something like that, I'm just gonna do
The
a
whole
painting.
thing.
Yeah.
Then, yeah, okay.
Yes.
There's a painting in the Springfield City Temple of the well-filled mountain. Tell me a little bit about that painting. Do you remember the details?
Yeah, and I think they called it the Three Presidents. It's the big cliffs that you see when you drive along I-15. Yeah, I mean, these are landscapes that I've grown up looking at. You know, to me, it's like the mountains are my friends. You know, it's like I just, wherever you are in Utah, it's like, okay, I remember that mountain, I know that mountain. I'm painting places and things that I like. And so that's, you know, that's an area that I love. So that was a lot of fun to do. But it was, you know, just, I took some photos. I mean, my parents are from Cache Valley, so I spent a lot of time going up and back. And I'm always, when you get through that area, I'm always like shooting, you know, because there's always good stuff.
Yeah, a lot of strong lines and
Yeah,
diagrams.
and I've painted those mountains from other directions too. Sometimes when you're going south, you can get a, you know, really fun, you know, you know, it's a totally different shapes and lighting, but it's, you know, there's still interesting things there. But yeah.
I was just curious, because you're teaching and you've got 4 galleries you're supplying and you're doing murals, like, and you've
Yeah,
got.
well, I'm not a teacher. I'm an art director, so we're like an in-house ad agency for the university. So I have taught, when I was getting my master's degree, they did give us a class, and I did teach adjunct for a year at Weber State, but that was when my gallery work really started to take off, and it was just kind of like, I don't have time to work full-time at a studio, a graphic design studio on campus, do gallery work and teach, so, yeah.
So as a director, do you judge shows and stuff?
No, it's like clients will come to us for, you know, like, a lot of times, you know, we're advertising the university, so, you know, I'll do logos, brochures, billboards, you know, a lot of digital now, like digital, we call them monument signs, like digital billboards for, you know, outside and inside things, but, you know, it's like advertising work, which is, you know, in my mind, it's allied with fine art, but it's sort of the commercial side. But Maynard Dixon, you know, he worked at an ad agency for several years. He did billboards, and you know, he said that was very helpful for him because he learned about color, composition. You know, how do you get right to, you know, like something that, because when you're selling a product, you know, you're not putting a lot of extraneous detail. You're trying to get something that's really strong and eye-catching. And for me, that's what, even though it's a fine art painting, I still want something that's eye-catching, strong compositionally, exciting to look at.
Didn't Ed Now do some commercial work too?
Yeah, he went to New York, and he only was there for like a year or two. I mean, he worked at a really good ad agency in New York, but he was just like, I like the West. I want to be. And he went to a Hopi reservation and was teaching there, and that's where he really kind of became immersed in, you know, Western landscape. Even though he grew up in Phoenix, he grew up in Arizona, but he realized that in the West, there's something there that you can, you know, can sustain your whole career. So, yeah.
Is it my understanding you're working full-time to do you,
Yeah.
and then you're doing temple murals?
Well, these are only two. These, the Meridian, Idaho temple was done in I finished that in 2017. I got that job in 2015. When I do a temple mural, a lot of times I have to kind of put the gallery, you know, the galleries kind of go to the back burner. So a lot of times I'm not doing shows for the galleries.
That's what I want to follow up on, is how do you manage to keep everything going? I mean, supply a gallery and then working full-time.
Yeah, so, you know, you just try and, sometimes there's enough downtime between when you're finished the mural and then installing it, like I'll do some projects and get some stuff to the galleries. St. George was a 4-year process. I got the job in 2018. We got the concept approved, but we didn't install it until 2022. But you know, you just find time. You know, I've done enough paintings that I'm fairly quick with smaller work. The advantage of having the opportunity to paint something so large is it teaches you when you work really large, you can do smaller work a lot faster. You're not as intimidated by, you know, the size of, like if you're doing something like this big, it's like, you know, well, that's not as big as a wall that I did. You just get a bigger brush and you just knock it out. But it's a challenge. I mean, and it would be nice to just get up, go to the studio and not worry about anything else, but it's like, you know, know, I have a family, I've got, you know, and the nice thing about working for the U is I've been saving for retirement for over 30 years, and I've, you know, built up. So I'm getting to the point where I think I will be able to walk away from the U, and I'll have a steady income, and then I can keep selling in galleries. But the thing about gallery sales, though, is they do go up and down, and when people are concerned about the economy, you know, they'll kind of stop buying sometimes. Although sometimes I've heard that, you know, people who are very wealthy, that doesn't bother them, and they'll just keep buying our work. You just want to be in those places, though, where they have those connections, and that's where, you know, for me, people will ask, well, why don't you just sell your own artwork online by yourself? And, you know, they're usually pretty outraged when they find out how much a gallery takes. It's usually 40, 50, in some cases 60%, but usually the galleries I'm in are 40 or 50%. But that commission, though, for me is worth it, because those connections that the gallery makes, I wouldn't be able to do myself. Like, I wouldn't have gotten the Wes Anderson movie without being in Medicine Man Gallery down in Tucson. You know, it was just being in that gallery got me that job. So for me, it's like, it's worth it. Because then they sell consistently enough that you can make it up with, you know, with your, usually when you're selling at a higher price too, you know, you still get what you need. But yeah.
The travel work you did for the U, were you intentionally trying to match the look of the national park posters?
Yeah, and
Or was that just a fun coincidence?
no, actually, when I'm done, I've got some magnets people are welcome to take. And I didn't show them here, but I did a series of Utah travel posters that we sold during the Olympics. And that was when I first developed the style, that was what inspired me, was those National Park WPA posters. But I thought, why don't I do like a digital version of this, rather than try and silkscreen, but if I do this digital, like, there's so many more opportunities for printing at bigger sizes or smaller sizes and things like that. But the style is definitely inspired by the WPA posters, yeah. But I also, you know, there's a lot of people kind of doing the same style, but I do, when I get a trip, I will look and see what has been done, what travel posters were made in the 30s or 40s, you know, that are in that style, and then I kind of decide what I want to do.
How did you get the church commissions? Was that from your galleries too, or was that something different?
Well, I think, you know, as mentioned, I probably should have showed the slide, but I think the church commissions came from getting that City Creek mural.
Oh.
So if you go to the City Creek food court, if you go to the McDonald's, it's right by the stairwell, right next to the McDonald's. So when they were building the City Creek, they had I think they were gonna put a window there. They had a big space that then they filled it in, and they needed something to go there. And there was an architect who happened to like my work. He'd seen it in something and, you know, reached out and said, hey, do you wanna do this? I'd never worked that big before, but I knew it was a good opportunity, and I just took it. And so we filled it in, we got it hung, and I think it led to other things. But that's one thing too, is sometimes it might be intimidating sometimes to take on these jobs or these things that you're not sure you can do, but you just have to kind of say, I'll make it work. And that's like with the Wes Anderson movie, because I was doing the St. George mural, and I was like already way behind when they called, and then I'm like, oh, well, if I take this movie, am I gonna screw up this commission? And they said, well, you know, and he does have a lot of notes, but then it was just like, well, you know, he's a famous director. This is a once in a lifetime thing. So I just said yes, and I just made it work. You find time, you find ways to make it happen, and you just have to keep, you know, sometimes stuff doesn't work out. Sometimes, you know, your finished painting isn't quite what you had in mind, but you just keep doing it, keep going back. And I was talking to my friend the other day where, you know, there's that quote where it's saying insanity is just doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. But in art, though, I think you keep doing it again and again and again, and you will eventually get the result you want, but it sometimes takes a long time. But don't be afraid to just, you know, keep doing it again if that's how you want to do it. You'll find your way.
I have a question too.
Yeah.
So when you work in the temple and on the movie production, do you have to give up some rights of copying your own or showing your own work?
Well, I don't like sell prints of that work because I don't own the copyright for that. So, and that's, I think they want to make sure that I'm not like, selling stuff that way. And so, and I don't like, I won't have that stuff on my website or, or social media, but, I'll show it to groups, but.
You did sell the copyright for those types of.
Oh yeah, yeah, I don't own the copyright, so I'm not gonna be making stuff. But I do get people every so often saying, oh, can I get a print of, the Asteroid City stuff? And it's like, no, the movie company owns that. I think the church does with some of those paintings, you can buy prints, but it's sort of like, the process of getting a print is, I can't remember, they were explaining it to us, but to me it's like, I don't really like doing prints myself. And it sounds kind of counterintuitive, but it's like, for me, it's easier to do the painting, sell the painting in the gallery, and then do the next painting. But if you do prints, you've got a whole bunch of inventory, then you've got to try and sell, and it's just hard, and you don't make that much off of prints. For me, it's like originals is where you make the money. But there's other artists who've done really great with prints, and they know exactly what they're doing. But for me, it's been through galleries that I've really, and the gallery relationships have always been really nice, because the gallery owner usually, they know the collectors, they know what's going on, especially the Medicine Man Gallery in Tucson. I mean, I've gotten a lot of write-ups in like Western Art Collector because the owner knows the publishers of that magazine, and so having that person who's advocating for your work is so nice. So to me, but it's a business relationship. I need to make sure I'm giving him work, that he can sell, and but then he's trying to promote my work too.
Yeah.
So yeah. Let me just get her and I'll.
Do you have any advice for how to build a relationship with a gallery when you're starting out?
Well, so for me, because it's hard to walk into a gallery with stuff, and I did it a few times, and they were like, oh, you're kind of close, but no. What worked for me was entering like the Springville Salon. Now I know it's a hard show to get into. Like there's like 1,000 entries, and they've got about 250. And the first year I entered, I didn't get in, but I kind of pushed myself to like make bigger work. Because if you look at a lot of these shows and you look at a lot of museums, like work that stands out is at a bigger scale. And so that's one thing I really tried to do early on in my career, is work larger, because the bigger the piece, the more of an impression you make. So the painting that won this year was 60 inches. It was not the biggest painting I've done, but it was still a little bit bigger than what I usually do. I wasn't expecting to win, but I thought, well, this bigger size will maybe help get it in the show. That was what I was just hoping for. But so when you get in shows like that, you get noticed. Then when the galleries come to you, it's so much easier. And that's like with Meyer in Santa Fe. They'd seen what I was doing in Tucson, and they reached out and said, we want you to be in the gallery. So of course you're like, oh, of course, I'd love to do that. But it's hard to go in cold. But you just have to start entering shows and taking your knocks if you don't get in, but realizing that no, I have something I can say, and you just keep doing it, and do it because you want to do it, and do things that you want to do. So yeah.
Oh, so mine's a similar question. Where is it again? No, I can't remember. Sorry, that was very interesting.
But I'd also say, don't worry if other people are doing the same thing that you're doing, because there's no way that you're going to both do the same kind of art. If you like painting Mount Olympus, paint Mount Olympus. Everybody in Salt Lake's painting Mount Olympus, but we all have our own unique viewpoint, no matter what we do. So,
I remembered. So, when you look at your work, do you have standards standards or things that you know, quality checks that you have that help you say, yeah, this is gallery ready, or?
I usually try and, when I was first starting out, I would take paintings into the office and I'd let people look at them, and you know, you'd kind of take the comments, and sometimes people would, I remember one woman said to me is, oh, the foreground doesn't look nearly as finished as the mountains, because you know, the mountains were like what I really liked, but you know, and I was like, what does that mean? Or, you know, but you know, you just have to kind of like, you know, you just sort of, you know in your mind, I think, how you want the finish to be. You know, sometimes it takes a while, and I mean, for me, I tend to want things to look a little more finished. Sometimes people are really great at these loose, you know, gestural paintings, and I've just never been that good at it. I tend to, but I'm trying to avoid getting too tight and boring, and that's why I came up with the 3Ds. It's like, I don't want to render everything all the same and have all my edges be really crisp and sharp, because then that's kind of boring too. So that's why I just try and remember, you know, remind myself though. Yeah.
What ideas or advice would you give for somebody just trying to develop their skills, their general art skills? Say you're a young person, you want to get into art. What kind of things stand out to you that would help progress their abilities?
Well, drawing is, you know, like practice drawing every day. And what I tell people too is paint every day. Like spend an hour every day painting. You know, like sometimes I think we think about TV shows that we watch, and you know, like it's easy to just, you know, you lose an hour or two every night if you watch the same show. But take that time and paint. I mean, have the TV show on. Like I love watching TV, and I'll have stuff on when I'm working, but you'll be surprised at how much you get done if you do it every single day, but just for an hour. Because I think sometimes we think, oh, we've got to like spend 3 or 4 hours on a Saturday to get this done, but it's like so much to like get all our stuff out and, you know, start the painting, and you know, but to me, I just have a dedicated work area, and even if I don't want to paint, I'll just do it for an hour and then come back the next day and do it again. And then shoot your own reference. Like find mountains and, you know, places that you're interested in, and shoot your own stuff, and then use that for your paintings. Because when it's your own photo, it's a lot easier to be excited about it, I think, than when you're just like, you know, copying somebody else's stuff out of a magazine. Now, as an illustrator, I've done that. You know, I've had to do that for things. But for me, what the paintings I'm most excited about are like, oh, I was there, I shot that picture, I shot those clouds, you know, I did that myself. The whole thing is something that I found.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
All
you.
right, big round of applause for Bruce. Thank you so much. I think this format was really nice for you to be able to sit and talk with us for 20 minutes, because we don't always get that, and being able to share all of your experiences and all the images was incredible. So enjoy, go back and look at the paintings in the back, and thanks for coming tonight.
Okay. Oh, thank you. It's just that website. Yeah. Do you have a panel right here? One went for 18 bucks. So Ghost Rider.
And you charge it.
Right now.
Yes, they, I know, texture, yes.
Yeah.
Just like the ordinary, you know, like the ordinary house.
Although I do like painting.
Tab, she's, oh, I see her over there. Oh, Beverly said, I also want to catch something. Yeah, she showed me some. Yeah, I want to see paintings. We don't see paintings. Oh, what do you think? Yeah, you said, yeah. Cut back a little bit on it. I told him, I said, that's crazy because he did really detailed things.
Well, I go to Tanner Frames if I need something. I go to Tanner.
It was later on.
They'll make paintings for me. So Travis Tanner's left.
You can really see that color. It was a landscape way off. I felt that's not helpful to me. That was kind of what I decided. Yeah, I need to start branding my business. Oh, I know. Always yeah. You let me turn this off really quick. I forgot to. It's still running, and I want to